Without further ado, get to meet Terry and hear her story. She and her husband Paul arrived in Fairbanks in 1972 when Paul accepted a position here at UAF. Their first child was born a few months later. In addition to eventually caring for and homeschooling her 3 kids, Terry tended the family's small-scale farm garden and volunteered with the Northern Alaska Environmental Center, becoming in time board president and temporary acting director. She was also known as a founding member of the Alaska Conservation Foundation. After her kids started Pearl Creek Elementary, Terry started Love Inc., no grass growing under her. And she ran that for 16 years. She's volunteered with the Literacy Council and developed an adult reading program. She shared her passion for vegetable gardening by teaching classes at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UAF and the First Presbyterian Church she is a stalwart member of. She currently enjoys leading a small group Bible study with Paul and occasionally helps him with a weekly meal program he runs at First Presbyterian. So please welcome Terry Reichardt. Now, Terry, given your long membership at Love Inc., and I want to ask about your faith life. And have you always had a strong religious sense?
No. I was raised as a Christian, I guess in a Christian culture. And by the time I went away to college, I got really smart and I'd never really had any experience with God, so, I couldn't, it just seemed to be accepting what other people said and, so anyway, I decided I'd become an atheist. And so I was an atheist a long time. Mm-hmm. I guess in my early 20s, I had a lot of people in my family die, including my parents, and I think that really got me searching because, you start thinking, what is the point to life? And I had a crisis in my mid-30s that really put me on my knees. Mm-hmm. And, it was like, God, if you exist, I need some help. And I didn't hear exactly what I wanted to hear, but I definitely experienced God, which just sort of blew me away and got me really searching, trying to understand. I started having other experiences with God, answered prayers. I was learning all I could and finally thought, I mean, if you go and start reading about different religions, it gets really confusing. So finally I decided there are all these churches in Fairbanks that specialize in God and maybe I ought to go and see what they have to say. So we started visiting churches and
was First Presbyterian your first?
No, that was not the first church we visited, but Paul had gone to a Presbyterian college, so he thought that was one we ought to visit. And the pastor was great. I mean, he followed up and I could ask all kinds of questions. Every question I asked, he'd give me a book to read. And which was exactly what I needed, no pressure, nothing, just, read this. And I finally decided that the Jesus thing was, that took me a while to understand why I needed Jesus and what he had done. I mean, from everything I read about him, he was really cool, but why did I need Christ? So anyway, that's a long way around saying, finally I became a Christian.
Yeah. Well, and many people who join a faith community aren't necessarily socially engaged, and social justice issues aren't a driving concern for them, but they do seem to be for you, obviously, with Love Inc. and your work earlier with the Environmental Center. You're very clued into that, it seems to me. Do you have a sense where that came from, that social engagement?
Well, probably to some degree out of the culture I grew up in, but probably mostly from my faith. Christians are called to serve. I always liked Glenn Hackney's explanation when someone would ask him why one time I asked him, don't you get tired picking all this trash up that, you already cleaned the street last week and now here's more. And his answer is always the same, 4 words, Jesus was a servant. And I think that's, where, if you're following Christ, you're a servant.
Mm-hmm. Love Inc. is such a foundational organization for so many people in the interior. When you were really deeply involved in helming it, what was the mission of the organization? What did it start out? Because it wasn't homegrown. There was a model elsewhere, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, that's interesting. So I can speak to the mission then, right? I haven't been involved with it for a long time.
Sure.
So, things change, and in fact, they've changed their name to Helping Alaska. So I'll talk about when I ran it. And the mission then, which we sort of adjusted a bit from the national, was to provide opportunities to members of churches to help people in need. And it was not to help people in need. And that is sort of a hard concept but it was important to us because most people in churches would like to help people in need. There are a number of barriers to that. A lot of times people live isolated from need. They're just not aware of it, or they don't know enough about a situation to feel comfortable getting involved. They might screw things up more than help. I think one of the big issues is lots of times people have the resources they have to offer aren't really what the need is, And so if we could match the resources people have to needs, in other words, if someone, I'm trying to think of some examples is the best way to do it. Somebody works long hours, has a family at home. They don't have any time, but maybe they have money. They could pay rent. Or someone's retired and has a tight budget, but they have time. They could provide rides to someone. So that, people have different resources, and the trick is to somehow find the needs that they can address. And if you can do that, at the same time, you're going to be meeting needs. Because, really, the community is amazing. The churches are amazing. There were hundreds and hundreds of people who would sign up and offer just unbelievable. They'd take someone into their home, or they'd, take care of someone's baby if they're in prison, or, I mean, just
Yeah.
Amazing generosity. So it was just a matter of how can you connect all these resources to the needs in the community. And when we started, it was it was after the pipeline boom, it was after the oil boom, it was sort of during the economic crash.
Yeah, that's right, in the 80s,
And
right.
there was a lot of need.
Well, now, the model that you drew on, was it a challenge to adapt it to Fairbanks in any way? I mean, our
Yeah.
weather conditions, the
Sure.
way our community spread out. So I'm kind of interested in that. Was that a
Yeah,
challenge?
and I didn't really answer your question about the model, because there was a program in Michigan that started called Love Inc. And it was really funny because at that time, during that sort of economic crash, our church was sort of being overwhelmed. Our church is downtown in the middle of town, so people were coming in the door constantly asking for help, and our pastor was just overwhelmed. He was also sort of, he could never say no. So anybody who would come in and ask for money, he'd just always give it to them. And sometimes that wasn't appropriate. But he was sort of really struggling with this. And at the same time, I had put my last child into school. I'd been homeschooling the kids during grade school. We didn't, Pearl Creek School didn't exist at that time. We were out in Goldstream, and my oldest daughter had started at Fox, and they really weren't able to provide what she needed. They had double classes. They wanted to skip her a grade, and it just wasn't great for her, and that's how I got into homeschooling. But anyway, I was making the transition. Pearl Creek School was there. I'd gotten my other kids in, and so my last one I got in, and I thought, okay, now time to go back to work. And I'd always worked in a lab, which you could always get a job that way, and you could make decent money. But I was praying at that time. I thought, well, I'd really like to do something that would make a difference, So I was praying to God, where should I apply? What should I be looking for? And one time when I was praying, I just got this communication, go down to church. And I thought, what? Wonder if that's from God. I walk into church, the pastor says, hi, what are you doing? And I say, I don't know. I thought, well, anyway, I went down to church, and I sort of expected to feel silly, and the pastor came rushing. I said, look at this. And he had this newspaper article with this editorial by a guy named Michael McManus, and it was about this program in Michigan called Love Inc. that just seemed to have some possibilities of how we could get people and get more resources addressing these needs that we were seeing all the time. And so anyway, that's what started. They were incredibly helpful. Their motto was of a clearinghouse, and that needs would go through and then be doled out to churches. And so they were helpful in helping us put together, the articles of incorporation, bylaws, all that kind of paperwork you need to do to get started that I was probably not very cognizant of. And Fairbanks was a unique place. So, we had our own challenges. Yeah.
We'll get back to that. I want to get some biographical material out of the way right now. Where did you and Paul meet?
Let's see. He was the teaching assistant in my organic chemistry lab my junior year in college at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
No kidding.
Oh, he was cute. So, but no, staff and students would never have relationships. So,
Sure.
That couldn't go anywhere. But he then got another job, and I don't know, somewhere along the line we started hanging out together with another friend, and then somewhere along the line, friendship turned to something more serious.
Let me just quickly ask, was going to college a given in your family? Were you expected to go on to college? How did that work?
Well, that was a Sputnik age, or that, everyone was being encouraged to go to college, even women. And you were expected to get married and have a family, but you needed to be able to make a living, and so that was encouraged, and yeah.
Yeah. Now you had a lot of science, but I love your response when we talked earlier, because you fell in love with every subject you had.
I know.
That's
a problem.
That's kind of tough, right? When you have to declare a major.
I know. I started out, I thought I wanted to teach math, and then I fell in love with chemistry. So then I thought, well, I could solve the world's problems with chemistry, and then I discovered how much I loved English and literature. I probably the thing that pushed me, I ended up getting a degree in English probably because I needed to finish in 4 years, and I needed,
when you love every course.
I needed one more semester to get in chemistry, but I had it in English. So anyway, I had a degree in English, and I thought I'd really love to teach English. So that was sort of my thinking when I did that.
But when you graduated, didn't you work in a series of labs?
Well, so I graduated. I didn't have a degree in teaching. So, if you're a woman and went into an employment agency, they tell you to be a secretary. But so I would never tell them I had a degree in English. I'd tell them I was a chemist. And then there are a lot of lab jobs. I got right out of college, I did a summer at home. My mom was still alive and my dad had died, and I needed to get home. And I spent the summer volunteering at a program in inner city Philadelphia, which was pretty cool. But anyway, my first job after college was at the Enzyme Institute at Wisconsin, and I worked for, I don't know how I got that job, for Gobind Khurana, who did research on the synthesis of DNA.
Oh, wow.
Which sounded so cool to me. And he won the Nobel Prize in Medicine while I was there. So that was so interesting to be there in this huge operation and with people from all over the world. That was pretty cool. That was my first experience being in a place that had just so many different ethnicities and people from all over the world. And it was, I guess, also sort of really during the civil rights movement, too. So it was so cool to be in a place with people from every race. I mean, he was from Pakistan, there were people from India, from Africa, from Europe, all over the place. And you just couldn't, race became so irrelevant.
Well, they were
so cool.
heady times, weren't they?
They were.
There was the sense that the world might be changing for the better.
Yeah. It was also Vietnam.
Yeah.
And that was sort of awful.
Well, of course, Paul's in science too. And so I understand, was it in New Haven that you guys hatched this plot to go backpacking in Alaska?
Yeah. So he had a postdoc at Yale. I worked in the nuclear medicine department there, and after 2 years there, he took a position at Ohio State as a faculty member. And so the summer before that, we were going to take a vacation. We'd never done that before. Wow. And the one place we both wanted to go was Alaska. And we thought, wow, we could do that maybe. So, I mean, we had limited funds, so we bought all our food in New Haven and packed it all in our backpacks for a month, and got on the plane at Kennedy and flew up directly. That Pan Am flight flew from Kennedy to Fairbanks on its way to Japan and Tokyo. And we flew up, I don't know, it was about 8 hours, and I can remember flying into Fairbanks, I had never, looking at the plane, seen so much land, open land. And there was this huge river system. I thought it was the Yukon, you know. I just started crying. It was so beautiful, yeah. So anyway, we came to Alaska. We rented a car. We went up to up the Steese Highway and did a hike into a place called Nome Creek. And that was our first experience hiking in Alaska. I can remember we got up, we went over some ridges, and there we were up there looking down over all the what looked like beautiful fields to Nome Creek. And we were so tired and hot. It was a hot day. It must have been about 80, you know, and thirsty. And there we saw the stream and some nice spruce trees over there. We thought that would be a great place to camp. And we started almost running across these beautiful fields and learned about muskeg. And tussocks, and that was a long hike through the tussocks to that campsite. But we loved it. We went up the Steese, saw the Yukon at Circle, stopped at Circle Hot Springs and got showers. Stopped at Eagle Summit on the way back with all the mosquito dope gone and got eaten up by mosquitoes.
Of course.
Yeah. Then what did we do? We went down to Denali Park. You had to go down the Richardson and across the Denali Highway then. Mm-hmm. And you could drive through Denali Park then. So, and there weren't many people. You'd drive and you'd see someone, you'd wave, because, I mean, there were so few people.
Wow, sounds magical.
Yeah, and we hiked back there, did some backpacking, and wow, that was fun. That old lodge. Yeah, it was sort of like a Teddy Roosevelt lodge, you know. We went down to, through Anchorage into the Kenai Peninsula, did the Moose Range, did a canoe trip for a week in the Moose Range, and then we took a ferry down, drove down to Haines. So we saw a lot.
Boy, you
Dumped
sure
the
did.
car, the rental people, I guess they never knew where all we'd driven.
You failed to mention that.
We didn't know you weren't supposed to. And took the ferry down to Prince Rupert. Got in the middle of the night, tried to camp in the local park. And had all these drunk people tripping over us. And finally found some cheap hotel we could afford, and it sounded nice and quiet. We were so tired. And they took us up the steps and opened this big, heavy, soundproof door and put us in a room next to, it was a sailor with a couple of prostitutes or something, and we didn't get much sleep that night, but we were hooked on Alaska. And
I was going to say, was Ohio a little tame after that?
And on the way home to Connecticut, we stopped at Ohio State to look for housing and, you know, meet people and all that. And, oh dear. Anyway.
Yeah. So it must have set a hook because...
It did set a hook.
Yeah. Not long after, Paul accepts a position up here, right?
So when he had been looking for a position, at that time there were just no chemistry faculty positions. There are 2 available in the country. And he had sent out applications to lots of places, including Alaska. We were sort of thinking, well, what if, you know? And apparently they had kept his application. He got one of the 2 spots at Ohio State, and so we thought, well, okay, that's it. And you know, we really didn't like Ohio. This university was great. The faculty were wonderful, but it was sort of like McDonald land with white picket fences everywhere, and everyone lived, and we couldn't find places to hike anywhere. The one place we found, we thought we'd do a little backpacking trip and camp there. Well, by the time we finished our hiking and got to the campsite, we could hear all the motorcycles going because they were having a motorcycle convention, and you know, it just wasn't quite the same. So he had, every year you had to sign a contract for the university, you know, and he had this contract just sitting on his desk, and he just couldn't quite sign it. And then lo and behold, that this letter came from Yale, had been forwarded to you there, I think. And yeah, could we possibly interest you in looking at so that we were hooked, yeah.
Yeah, you came up here. So when you come up, where did you stay at first?
Oh, Yak Estates.
Okay.
So yeah, that was there was some limited university housing on campus for faculty, and then they had, the university owned Yak Estates at that time. I'm not sure.
I find it so interesting that as soon as you get here, you start gardening. So well,
we had limited incomes, and when you have limited incomes, you try to find ways to save money. We had always had a garden. That saved us a lot of money, and everywhere we went, we had a garden, and so the university had, community plots for us. So, of course, we had a garden.
Yeah, and so what I'm interested in, because later you volunteer at the Northern Alaska Environmental Center, was the outdoors always a passion for you?
I was probably, I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, and so we were outside all the time. And yeah, when I hadn't done anything like backpacking or camping or anything, but when Paul and I got married, he loved to fish, and we decided we'd like to camp. So we took some of the money we'd gotten for our wedding and bought a tent. And yeah, we could go up to northern Wisconsin. The paper companies owned all this woodlands all through Wisconsin, and so we could go up and camp and fish and just get out. So that's what our experience was then. We moved to Connecticut, and then we had state parks around. We had the White Mountains, and we started getting into backpacking. The equipment in those days was pretty minimal, so...
Well, compared to today.
Today, oh yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we sort of got into it that way. Yeah, I'm probably most comfortable outside.
Yeah. So what drew you to the environmental center? Did you just feel like, we talked earlier about the 60s and 70s, and ecology was a burgeoning concern in the landscape, and so.
Well, I guess where I grew up, which was rural at the time, was quickly becoming suburban. In Wisconsin, you know, where all these places we left to go, the paper companies were selling off all their land. All lakefront land was going to private places. I can remember one time going and camping by a lake we'd always camped at, and somebody coming in saying, "You can't camp here." You know, I mean, the world was changing so fast between the time I grew up and the time we moved up here. Land was just disappearing. And so access by, you know, people, the public, just was becoming very limited to state parks or whatever. And so that Alaska was so wonderful that way. When we came was just the beginning. It was pre-pipeline. It was the beginning of work on Alaska lands, Anilka. And so the state was divided into a third of the land went to the federal government, a third was given to the state, and a third was given to the native corporations. And so really, you know, the native corporations were going to do what they were going to do, and the state was going to. So really the only influence you had was on the federal lands, and the federal government was trying to figure out what lands to pick and how to manage them. And so I immediately got involved there because I'd been to some of these places, and even though I was new in town, you know, some of the places, our first trip up here, we'd hiked in and I just had fallen in love with. So I just was enthusiastic to see some of these lands protected, because in my mind, in one generation, I'd seen so much change. I mean, yeah, boy, the land is disappearing. So anyway, I got involved that way, and then, you know, issues keep coming up. Land has always been threatened. I mean, once it's developed, it's gone, and then the next one's under threat. So, yeah, it's a never-ending effort to try to protect land for the general public to use. And it's so neat to live in a place where you can go out and hunt, you know, or pick berries locally, or, I mean, there's all the land to do these things on hike, raft. Where my daughter lives in Minnesota, the only way she can hunt is ask a farmer for permission, because all the land's privately owned. Or, you know, the streams we in Connecticut, where we fish, you better not eat the fish, or you couldn't drink the water even if you treat it. I mean, everything was polluted, you know? So, yeah, we have a treasure here.
Yeah.
And yeah.
You know, your experience though, going through and becoming board president and then acting director, I'm wondering, did that experience aid you down the line when you took over, let's say, the responsibility for Love Inc.?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Although I mean, I didn't have any experience in administration. I mean, when we worked in a lab, we just sort of handed paperwork to the office and it mysteriously got taken care of, you know? So, yeah, I was pretty dumb that way. I mean, I didn't even know how to use a file cabinet. Yeah, I was concerned about issues when I was running and learning to run a board. Yeah, it was a great experience.
Right.
And they put up with me.
But I think sometimes in small organizations like that, you have a chance
Yes.
to experience
Yeah.
what leadership might be
Yeah.
and working together as a team and
Yeah.
that esprit de corps that's so
Yeah.
essential.
Yeah, absolutely. And you make mistakes and
Right.
learn from them.
Right.
Yeah.
Hopefully. Yeah. I'm still working on that piece.
No.
Well, and now I want to turn because, as we mentioned, and you've mentioned a couple of times, you homeschool the kids. And so I would be lost if I had to. Our kids are thankfully grown up and they seem to be sane and productive. So, but did you just say, that's it, I am going to homeschool? What drove that decision?
And so homeschooling's really popular now, but back then there weren't a lot of choices. So my oldest daughter was at Fox School. She did kindergarten there and then first grade. And, they had started this gifted and talented program in the schools, but Fox didn't have the resources for that. So that wasn't, they showed them movies a couple times. And so their solution was, let's just skip second grade and put her in third grade. But third grade was third and fourth grade combined, and it had a lot of really tough kids in it. And my daughter was shy and gentle, and it just wasn't going to work for her. So I looked at, I went and looked at whatever else was private schools in Fairbanks, but there's a big transportation problem from Goldstream down into Fairbanks, and homeschooling seemed the best solution. They had the Calvert program, and they had the borough had a program, and there was a state program. So I signed up for the borough program, and
Did you like teaching?
I loved teaching, working with the kids. I can't say I loved the homeschooling program from the borough because there was so much busy work. And it's like we'd learn all this neat stuff during the summer, and go to the library and learn about bugs and everything. And then school would start and we'd have to do all this busy work. So yeah, it was a challenge, but the borough program was really very flexible, and as I got a little more experience, I'd say, well, instead of doing the science book, could I just use this experiments in the kitchen book? And they'd say, yeah, sure. Or, this one child, we'd rather read Tom Sawyer, and they'd say, fine, we'll take spelling words from there instead of the spelling.
Wow.
So they were pretty flexible and worked with us, but it's a huge amount of work.
Oh, I can imagine.
And so, yeah, when they built Pearl Creek School, our oldest daughter was in the first year. She went into fifth grade, and the school was great. So the next year, I sent our shy little middle daughter to fourth grade, and then the next year, our son went to third grade, and they had wonderful teachers. And yeah.
Two questions about that. First, you can tell you're passionate about things, and you admitted you loved all these subjects. Did you impart that enthusiasm, do you think, to your kids?
I don't know. Let's see. My middle daughter is an English teacher in high school, and she pretty much, I guess she's passionate about teaching. My oldest daughter teaches violin. She's passionate about teaching. So I don't know. My son does all kinds of neat engineering work and inventing things, and he really enjoys what he's doing. Yeah. life is great.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and then how was it? Was it hard on you when your brood went off to Pearl Creek?
No.
Oh.
Yeah, right. No, so that's when I started Love Inc. Yeah.
So, right. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But later, you work with the Literacy Council and you do adult education, reading. Do you think the time you spent with your kids as a teacher influenced how you went about that program?
Because I wanted to make sure my kids knew how to read before they hit school. So I did teach them to read, and I just thought it was a shame if people didn't know how to read. And actually, I had always wanted to teach math, but I had always wanted to teach people to read. I mean, I can remember being in grade school and reading seemed so easy, and all these kids around me seemed to have a lot of trouble, and I never thought the teacher really knew how to teach them. So, yeah.
There you go.
Anyway,
you're on.
So when I left Love Inc., God had opened the door, really led me into doing Love Inc., and I'd always said, Lord, when it's time to be done, you tell me, I'll leave. And there was a time when he just said, your role is done. And so I left, and then I was like, okay, Lord, what do I do now? And I wasn't getting any answers. And man, I struggled with that. So finally I said, okay, well, what do I like to do? And anyway, so I thought, well, that would be. So I went to the Literacy Council and I went through their program, and they had had some materials with a program called the Wilson Reading Program. And they let me have those materials, and I trained myself in that stuff and started working with students that they'd give me. And pretty soon they said, here, you take the program, and here's all the materials. And I started the program in our church and started using volunteers there. But there's a lot of work going into it. It's not just easy. You don't just sit down with someone and read with them and they learn to read. Especially adults, their brain works differently than kids, really. Their subconscious brain isn't as strong in terms of learning as their sort of conscious brain, and you really have to teach them techniques for reading. And so, yeah, I was pretty good at that, and I just had a full slate of students and really enjoyed it.
Do you think there's also, I think there's a stigma if you don't know how to read and you're an adult. So there's, I imagine, emotional and psychological hurdles to learning.
And I can remember one student who, as computers came on, he worked for Napa, and nobody knew he didn't know how to read. And all of a sudden he was supposed to be able to do a lot of stuff with computers, and he couldn't get away with not reading. He had a really good salary that he was dependent on, had a really responsible position. He was a salesman, and he was in a panic. And he needed to learn to read. So that, things like that. Yeah, everybody had a different story. Interestingly enough, the vast majority of students were men and a lot of them were African American men. And if people would come from a different dialect, that a number of dialects in our country don't match the written dialect. You don't really realize that writing has a dialect, but you know, an African American Southern dialect is very, very different from a written dialect, and so a child is trying to learn to read, speaking one dialect and reading another, and thinking that the words are the same, and it is totally confusing. It's sort of like, you know, speaking French and reading English, some in the extreme. And there are a couple of other dialects that, you know, are a real problem. So I'd often see students who I think didn't learn to read because of that. Also, most all of them had had trauma in their childhood. And when a child is experiencing trauma at home, they cannot concentrate at school. They just don't absorb it. They're constantly thinking about being safe, or, you know,
well, I'm sure they're looking out and making sure, and so they're always
so
scanning.
Those were the problems that I generally saw that I would say were probably the reasons people couldn't read. There are a lot of reasons people can't read. Here and there I get some students that were developmentally disabled, and I generally found that I came to not taking those students because I really required whoever was taking care of them to come with them, and I found most people in that position weren't willing to invest that kind of time. But yeah, so.
You know, hearing you talk, both in homeschooling and in this adult literacy, some of the power that I'm sensing is in this engagement, one person to another.
Sure.
And as opposed to a large, you go to these college classes in these auditoriums, and the lecturers in a little tiny ant down there. But
and that's so rewarding.
Yeah.
To work one-on-one, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, another aspect of your teaching is gardening, master gardening. And so I guess before we get to the teaching part of that, when we've been growing crops for thousands of years, you know, so what have you learned in your time? Because you are known to have an extraordinary garden. You have this amazing root cellar that if we ever have an atomic test, I'm heading to, because it's cinder block, and I think, well, it'll survive there, you know. Anyway, but I kid a little bit, but you take it very seriously. So how has your gardening experience changed or matured, Terry? Since you got
over the years?
Yeah, over the years.
Let's see. Well, we've always grown food, you know, as much as we could, because that always saved us money, and it also tastes better. I guess as an environmentalist, I think that growing your own food and not having to transport it, you know, that always, the amount of energy used always concerned me. These days, I'm most concerned about climate change. And, you know, just recently, the governor's office published some numbers saying, let's see, in the 50s, I think 50% of our food was grown in Alaska. And now 95% of our food is imported.
Wow.
That means 5% is grown locally. And, you know, commercial food production is responsible for 1/3 of our carbon footprint. And a lot of that is transportation. So, you know, if we all could do a few things to cut back on our carbon footprints, it would really make a difference, especially in the Western world, because we're putting out the most. And for Alaskans, you know, transportation, that's one of the biggest carbon footprint contributors in commercial food production. And so for Alaskans, we're really doing it because our food comes from so far. And it's unnecessary. And so I've sort of been curious as to whether we could grow all our food needs. I mean, we hunt and fish, but you know, if you don't have meat, what do you do growing a garden? And I found, you know, you can grow vegetarian, great. We can grow, the university has developed this wonderful sunshine barley. I call it Alaska rice. Why on earth do we import rice from California or Japan or wherever we get it when we have wonderful barley that's high protein? Rice hardly has any protein, it's all starch, and lots of vitamins, and it tastes so much better, and it's so easy to grow. Rice puts out a huge carbon footprint. I never understood that until I realized that. I think it's because of all the organic matter that's left decomposing after they harvest the rice. But it's a big contributor to our carbon footprint. And so, you know, let's eat Alaska rice. It just tastes a whole lot better. I can grow enough in our garden to give us a year's worth. And I can combine that with beans, which grow great, and peas, or some kind of legume, and have a complete protein. So, you know, there are all kinds of ways we can really provide what we need up here. So anyway, that's sort of my thing.
Yeah, well, no, but I think that came graphically to light during COVID because there were shipment problems, and it was extraordinary how quickly stores ran out of fresh produce, and there were bare shelves, and of course, a generation or more Americans have never experienced anything like that. Right. So it really was a wake-up call. But I think the mindset for many people was we're too far north to grow enough to sustain us.
And that's not, and it takes some searching to find varieties. The secret is all in the variety. A lot of varieties that grow in the lower 48 won't do well up here in our short season. But, you know, there are plenty coming out, well, don't get me going on Canada. Canada has done so much research, has so many wonderful varieties, and we can't get them. Because, I think because of trade regulations and whatever. And Paul keeps saying, well, call Murkowski and talk about it, and I never get around to that. Yeah, but yeah, there, you know, I've been working on getting varieties that do produce well here. So
when you taught at OLLI, the Master Gardening class, what were some of the questions that people want? Do they just want a bare bones? Do they want to know about these varieties that grow well? So tell me a little bit about teaching that, Terry.
Well, so I also teach, so I don't teach OLLI anymore. I teach a class downtown in the evenings. And I found that people in OLLI were really interested, but we're not, OLLI is sort of an older group of people. And right now, the class I teach downtown has a lot of young families, and they are really interested.
They're engaged in that.
They're really engaged, and they're really doing it. whereas we get sort of into our ruts.
No.
And we already have our home and our yard, and so, you know, we're not going to do a lot of different things. But young people are out, you know, they've just got their property and they have dreams of a great big garden, and they're going to do the Alaska lifestyle and, you know, really do it. So, yeah, they get pretty passionate. And it's not just that our shelves might be empty. It's so what is it? Last year they had those floods in Pakistan. What was the number? 30 million people were displaced by those floods that are caused by climate change. I can't get my head around 30 million people. That's like a tenth of our country's population. Where do they go? They've lost their farms, their livelihoods, everything. I mean, that's the kind of thing that should grab us. I mean, that makes us cry to think that, you know, because we want this very comfortable lifestyle, that's what other people in the world have happened to them. Yeah, I get emotional about that.
Yeah, and deservedly so, because it's going to affect us all, you know, whether we want to acknowledge it or not.
So somehow if each one of us could use a little less energy, you know, just work on those things and maybe put a little more physical energy. You know, we go to gyms and use electricity to exercise when we could use that energy to do some work at home.
Yeah, and get exercise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, you know, I kind of, to wrap it up a little bit, I was so interested, again, it's reaching out, it's teaching, it's learning, you and Paul in Bible study class. And I'm curious, both of you have science backgrounds, but you don't have any problem blending faith and science.
Well, as being someone with a scientific brain, I'm a skeptic. So yeah, that's, I mean, probably why I threw it all out when I went to college. I'm a show me person. So, yeah, but God has shown himself to me. And so, yeah, I'm a fan. I'm passionate. So, no, I don't have a problem because you know, it's sort of like you do some experiments in the lab and you persuade yourself. So I've been persuaded.
That's a lovely way of putting it. Well, every time, about this time, we open up to questions from the audience. Does anybody have any questions for Terry? They're always so shy at first, you know, but it just takes one. Wendy?
Yeah, well, tonight I heard on the news of you know, people in the east, the floods. People are being displaced. You talk about people being displaced. They're being displaced in California.
Right.
With fires and all over the
Right.
place. I don't know how many thousands and so forth. So we're experiencing that in our own country
Right.
now.
Right.
It's not just Pakistan.
Amen. I know, but, you know, but, yeah. What?
So what year did you and Paul arrive in Fairbanks?
72. Yeah. Yeah. And it was the day, so our oldest daughter was born, thankfully late. She was supposed to be born in September. She was born 3rd of November. And it was, what was it, 40 below or something? and we had this little $100 VW car that Paul had to haul the battery inside every night and so it would start in the morning, and he went out. He was so scared that the car wouldn't start when I needed to go to the hospital. So he went out and he used all our savings and bought a new car. And I was mad because there were all our savings gone. But anyway, we had no trouble getting to the hospital. But it was 40 below or something like that.
He was investing in the family.
Well, this isn't a question, but this is a thank you for being part of our community.
Oh, I haven't had a chance to say this community is so incredible. We're so lucky to live here, and you know, being involved with Love Inc., it's just amazing how generous people have been in this community, and they still are. And I remember William Wood talking, he came and talked to our board of directors once, and he said, there are more, and I don't know if this is still true, more nonprofits per capita in Fairbanks, Alaska than anywhere else in the world.
Now, Terry, I think we have somebody online with a question.
It's actually my own question.
Oh, okay.
So people in my generation, we have this thing, I think it's called generational blindness, where we don't realize like how bad things have gotten with the climate because we don't remember a world where it was better.
Oh.
How do you fight against something like that?
So generational
Wow,
blindness,
that's
not
a
knowing.
good
I was
question.
born in 2001.
Yeah.
So like fire season has always been a thing for me, and droughts have always been a thing for me, and all that. So
Uh-huh. Do you read the news?
yeah,
So can you read about some of the changes taking place?
yeah.
But it's just not real, huh?
It's not real to me because I don't remember a world where it was different than that.
So have you lived in Fairbanks all your life?
No.
Are you,
I moved here about a year ago.
oh, from the lower 48?
Yeah.
Do you see a difference between the Alaska and the lower 48?
Yes. The air it doesn't smell bad here.
Uh-huh.
It's like super clean, and there's like a lot of like public places I can go and just exist and not
Yeah.
feel that by people who are older than me.
It used to be like that down there. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a really good question. I'd say a lot of it has to do with educating yourself because you're hearing a lot about it.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I don't, maybe you ought to work on that.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, I think so. Sorry, I can't
Yeah, no,
give a lot of.
Well, if there are no more questions, there's some refreshments out there, including a cake with your picture on it.
I didn't see that.
Yeah. It wasn't homegrown, but it was homemade.
Homemade by
No,
who?
yeah. I'm thinking the picture was, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Aw.
Well, Terry Reichardt, thank you so much.
Thank you.